The stale air of the tiny city apartment felt thick and suffocating in Daniel's lungs, heavy with the ghosts of unpaid bills and the faint, heartbreaking memory of his late wife's perfume. He sat motionless at the wobbly kitchen table, his carpenter's hands, once capable of creating beautiful, sturdy things from raw wood, now resting limp and utterly useless on the peeling formica. They were calloused and strong, but they couldn't build a shield against the crushing, invisible weight of medical debt. Every sound from the indifferent city outside, the distant wail of a siren, the jarring rumble of a passing subway train, felt like a personal taunt, a reminder of a world that was moving on without him and his daughter. He could almost hear his wife's voice, a soft, painful echo in the oppressive silence, and he felt his heart physically ache, a dull, constant throb of grief and profound failure. The flickering neon lights filtering through the grimy window cast long dancing shadows that looked like specters on the walls, mocking his paralysis. He was 40 years old, a widower, a father, and he was trapped. The knot of dread in his stomach was cold and hard as stone. The eviction notice on the table was a brutal slash of red ink on cheap, flimsy paper. Final notice. The words seemed to scream at him in the quiet gloom, each block letter a hammer blow against his crumbling sanity. He had stared at it for what felt like hours, the cold, legal jargon blurring into a single, deafening threat. With a hand that trembled uncontrollably, he picked up his cracked phone, the screen's harsh white light illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He logged into his bank account, his breath catching painfully in his throat as the number loaded. $478.14. He felt a wave of nausea. That was it. The very last remnant of a life they had built together, systematically decimated by an unstoppable torrent of hospital bills, experimental treatments, and false hopes that had promised a future but delivered only bankruptcy. A sharp, gnawing pain suddenly twisted in his gut. Hunger, the raw, primal kind. He couldn't remember his last proper meal, making sure every slice of bread and drop of milk went to his daughter. The low, empty hum of the refrigerator was the soundtrack to his complete and utter ruin. In the other room, a small, still lump under a thin, worn-out blanket, his daughter Sophia was asleep, 8 years old. She was a tiny universe of trusting innocence in a world that had become relentlessly, brutally cruel. Daniel crept silently to the doorway, his own bare feet making no sound on the cold linoleum, terrified that the old building's groans would wake her. He just needed to see her, to confirm that she was safe, for this one fleeting moment at least. Her chest rose and fell in the steady, peaceful rhythm of a child's untroubled sleep, her face serene and beautiful in the dim, yellowed light filtering in from the hallway. A suffocating cascade of guilt washed over him, so powerful it threatened to bring him to his knees right there in the doorway. He had promised her mother, on her deathbed, holding his hand with a grip that was shockingly strong, he had sworn he would protect Sophia, that he would always provide a safe home for her. Now he was failing. Spectacularly, he was about to lead her into the terrifying uncertainty of homelessness. He felt his chest tighten, that sacred promise now a hot brand of shame upon his soul. He retreated back to the kitchen, where the sensory details of their poverty assaulted him from all sides. The apartment didn't just look poor, it had its own distinct smell. A thick, layered aroma of old dust, a pervasive dampness from a perpetual leak in the bathroom ceiling, and the fainter, cloying sweetness of decay from something forgotten in the back of a cabinet. Beneath it all, he could still sometimes catch the phantom scent of hospital antiseptic that seemed to have clung to his clothes, his furniture, his very skin, a constant reminder of their loss. The only sound within their four walls was the maddeningly rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the leaky kitchen faucet, each drop landing in the stained sink like a tiny liquid clock counting down their final hours in this place. Outside, the city provided its own uncaring symphony, the sudden scream of tires, the angry shouts of a distant argument, the ever-present wail of sirens weaving through the concrete canyons. A violent shiver racked his body, a deep, internal tremor that had nothing to do with the night's chill. It was the cold, hard touch of undiluted fear. Daniel moved to the single window, pressing his forehead against the cool, grimy glass. He looked down at the sprawling grid of city lights, a glittering, indifferent monster that had chewed him up and was now ready to spit him out onto the cold pavement. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a loneliness so complete it was a physical void in his chest. The friends who had filled the church at the funeral, the neighbors who had brought food, they had all faded away, absorbed back into their own stable lives, leaving him and Sophia adrift. His hope, once a stubborn flame he had painstakingly nurtured for his wife's sake, was now completely extinguished. There was nothing left but cold, dark ash. The nausea returned, climbing his throat like bitter bile. He squeezed his eyes shut, but there was no escape. All he could see behind his eyelids was the terrifying image of Sophia's face, her big brown eyes wide with confusion as he told her they had to leave, that they had nowhere to go. Tears he hadn't realized he was holding back began to stream silently down his cheeks, hot trails on his cold skin, each one a testament to his utter defeat. Hope was gone. He had reached the end. A week later, a single piece of mail disrupted the suffocating stasis of Daniel's despair. It was not a bill. The envelope was made of thick, cream-colored paper, a texture so out of place on the cluttered table that it seemed like an artifact from another world. His name and address were typed in a severe, old-fashioned font. With fingers that felt clumsy and numb, he tore it open, the sound of ripping paper unnaturally loud in the silent apartment. He unfolded the single sheet inside, his eyes scanning the dense block of legal text from a law firm he'd never heard of. A deep, instinctual suspicion coiled in his gut. He had learned the hard way that unexpected letters rarely brought good news. They were almost always another demand for money he did not have. He braced himself for another blow, his shoulders tense, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. But as he read, the familiar dread began to morph into something else entirely, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Sheer, unadulterated confusion. The letter was formal, cold, and concise. It informed him of the passing of a great uncle, a man named Elias, a name that was only a faint, dusty echo from his own childhood memories. He was the sole heir. The word inheritance leaped off the page, and for a dizzying moment, Daniel's mind filled with visions of a miraculous financial rescue. Then he read the specifics. It was not money. It was a property, a farm, located in a remote rural district hundreds of miles away. A single, fragile seedling of hope began to push its way through the compacted soil of his despair. A farm, a roof, land. It was a tangible asset, a physical place far from the crushing gravity of the city. He reread the letter 3 times, the paper crinkling under his trembling grip. There were no other options. This wasn't a choice. It was a lifeline, a frayed and uncertain rope thrown into the abyss he was falling into. He felt a flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope warm his chest. That night, sleep was impossible. The city's cacophony seemed to fade into the background as Daniel paced the small apartment, the lawyer's letter clutched in his hand like a holy relic. The farm was an absolute unknown, a gamble of monumental proportions, but staying was a certainty of ruin. He could picture it with horrifying clarity. The bailiffs, the humiliating removal of their few possessions onto the street, the look of terror in Sophia's eyes. The image was a spur, driving him toward the terrifying unknown. By the time the first weak grey light of dawn seeped through the grimy window, his decision was made. A frantic energy seized him. He began to pack, the sounds of his movements filling the apartment for the first time in days. The screech of packing tape being pulled, the zip of a duffel bag, the thud of old books being placed in a cardboard box. Each sound was a definitive action, a step away from the paralysis that had held him captive. His exhaustion was replaced by a strange, nervous adrenaline. He knelt beside Sophia's bed, gently shaking her awake. He had rehearsed the words in his head all night, trying to find a way to frame this desperate flight as something magical. "Sophia, my love," he whispered, his voice thick with a forced cheerfulness that felt like a lie. "How would you like to go on a big adventure? We're going to move to a farm. In the countryside, there will be fields and trees and lots of fresh air." Her sleepy eyes widened, first with confusion, then with the pure, uncomplicated excitement only a child can muster. "A farm? With animals?" she asked, her voice small and full of wonder. He felt a sharp, twisting pang of guilt. He knew nothing about this place, yet he was selling it to her as a paradise. "Maybe," he said, the word catching in his throat. "I will have to see." Her smile was so bright it was almost painful to look at, a beacon of innocent trust in the midst of his calculated deception. For a moment, her joy was infectious, pushing his own terror further down. Leaving the apartment felt like shedding a skin. Daniel took one last look at the cramped, miserable space that had been their home and their prison. The ghosts of his wife, of their financial ruin, of his own suffocating failure, seemed to linger in the stale air. He turned the key in the lock for the final time, the sharp click echoing down the empty hallway like a gunshot, severing their last tie to the life they had known. On the street, the city assaulted their senses for the last time. The acrid smell of bus exhaust, the damp, metallic scent of the pavement, the overwhelming feeling of being a tiny, insignificant cog in a relentless machine. He held Sophia's hand tightly. Her small fingers wrapped around his and hailed a cab to the bus station. A profound sense of finality washed over him, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and anticipation. He was leaping from a burning building, with no idea what he, if anything, would break their fall. The bus ride was an exhausting 8-hour ordeal. The vehicle itself was old, its engine emitting a constant, low groan that vibrated through the worn fabric of Daniel's seat and up his spine. He stared out the window, watching the dense, vertical maze of the city gradually give way to the sprawling, repetitive landscape of the suburbs. The familiar skyline, which had once represented opportunity, now looked like the jagged teeth of a trap he was finally escaping. He watched it shrink in the window until it was just a hazy smudge on the horizon, and then it was gone. A feeling of irreversible momentum took hold. There was no going back now. Every mile they traveled was a mile further from their old problems, but also a mile deeper into an unknown that could hold something far worse. The rhythmic hiss of the air brakes at each stop was a constant reminder of their slow, uncertain progress toward a future he had fabricated. As the hours bled into one another, the scenery outside transformed completely. The endless tracts of suburban houses dissolved into wide, open country. The air that seeped through the cracked bus window began to change, losing its chemical, urban edge and taking on the rich, loamy smell of damp earth and growing things. It was a scent of life, and it fed the fragile hope in Daniel's chest. Sophia, lulled by the constant motion and the engine's drone, had fallen asleep, her head resting heavily on his shoulder. He felt the warm, solid weight of her, a physical anchor of his immense responsibility. He stroked her hair, his rough carpenter's fingers gentle against her soft cheek. A fierce wave of protectiveness washed over him. He had to make this work. For her, he had to transform this desperate gamble into a real home, a real sanctuary. The weight of that promise felt heavier than all the city debt combined, a burden and a purpose all in one. They finally disembarked at a small, sun-bleached depot in a town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The silence was the first thing that struck him. It was a thick, heavy blanket, a stark contrast to the city's ceaseless clamor. The sun felt different here, too, a dry, baking heat that was more intense, more personal. A single, dusty taxi, an ancient model with visible rust spots, was parked by the curb. The driver, a weathered old man who barely grunted a greeting, tossed their bags in the trunk with an air of profound indifference. The old man's laconic silence and the town's deserted feel added to a growing sense of unease. The fragile hope Daniel had been cultivating began to feel thin, stretched taut by the sheer emptiness of the place. This wasn't just rural, it felt fundamentally disconnected. A place on the very edge of the map where people didn't arrive, but from which they disappeared. The taxi ride was the final stage of their journey into isolation. The paved road quickly gave way to a deeply rutted dirt track, forcing the old car to slow to a crawl. The sound of gravel and stones pinging against the undercarriage was a constant, percussive rhythm. With every jarring bump, a spike of anxiety shot through Daniel. The landscape grew wilder, the neat fields replaced by tangled thickets and imposing, dark woods. They hadn't passed another car, another house, another human being for what felt like an eternity. He felt a primal knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The city was a prison of concrete and debt, but it was a prison full of people. This was a different kind of confinement, one of vast, intimidating emptiness. Almost there, the driver grunted. The first words he'd spoken in 20 minutes. The words did not bring relief, but a fresh wave of trepidation. What, exactly, was there? The taxi finally shuddered to a halt, where the dirt track dissolved into an overgrown field. "This is it," the driver said, pointing vaguely toward a dense line of trees. "Paths through there." Daniel paid the man, his hands feeling clammy as he counted out the worn bills. He lifted a sleeping Sophia from the back seat, her dead weight a familiar comfort. For one brief, beautiful moment, standing at the edge of the property, the illusion held. The air was surprisingly sweet, thick with the heady perfume of unseen wildflowers and the clean scent of sun-baked pine. In that second, he allowed himself to imagine a simple, rustic cottage nestled just beyond the trees, a place of peace and quiet work. He could fix it up. He could build a life. He felt a final, powerful surge of fragile optimism, a belief that despite everything, they had made it. He took a deep breath of the sweet air and stepped forward, carrying his daughter into their new life. As Daniel guided Sophia past a defiant row of overgrown lilac bushes that must have once marked a welcoming path, the first wave of the farm's reality struck him, not as a sight, but as an olfactory assault. It was a physical blow. The clean, sweet air of the countryside was instantly and violently suffocated by a thick, wet miasma of profound decay. It was the complex, layered smell of damp wood slowly returning to earth, of stagnant water pooling in unseen hollows, and of generations of leaves composting into black slime. A reflexive gag constricted Daniel's throat, and he felt the meager contents of his stomach churn. The fragile optimism he had so carefully nurtured during the long journey didn't just fade. It was annihilated in a single, foul breath. A cold dread, more visceral and immediate than the city's abstract despair, began to seep into his very marrow. He instinctively tightened his grip on Sophia's small hand, a futile gesture to shield her from the stench that was not just a smell, but a promise of absolute ruin. Then, through a break in the foliage, he saw it, and his heart simply stopped. The word farmhouse was a cruel joke. What stood before him was a carcass, a skeletal ruin picked clean by time and neglect. A huge section of the roof had caved in, creating a gaping black wound that exposed the rotting innards of the structure to the sky. Most of the windows were not just broken, but gone, leaving dark, empty sockets that stared out like the eyes of a skull. The few that remained were crudely boarded up as if sealing a tomb. A wide front porch sagged at a drunken, perilous angle, its support columns rotted through at the base. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood a sickly, mottled grey, streaked with green algae. This was not a fixer-upper. This was not a sanctuary. This was a monument to decay, a place where hope had come to die long, long ago. The lie he told Sophia echoed in his head, mocking his stupidity. He took a few hesitant steps closer, a moth drawn to a flame that promised only destruction. The overpowering smell of mold became so intense it was almost a taste in the back of his throat, metallic and foul. It was mixed with the sharp, acrid ammonia scent of animal droppings, evidence that the house had long been reclaimed by whatever creatures inhabited the surrounding woods. He could hear them, faint but unmistakable. The dry, frantic skittering of rats or mice moving within the walls, the sound of tiny claws on decaying wood. A cold, damp air seemed to breathe out from the dark, gaping maw of the front doorway, a chilling exhalation despite the oppressive heat of the day. A shiver traced its way down his spine, a cold, spider-like touch of pure dread. The house felt diseased, actively malevolent. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt haunted by the very act of its own decomposition. It was a physical manifestation of his own internal ruin. His gaze snapped away from the house, and he forced himself to turn around, desperately scanning the horizon for any sign of comfort, any anchor in this sea of desolation. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. Just an endless, undulating ocean of overgrown fields, the grasses tall and wild, and a dark, impenetrable line of ancient trees fencing them in. No other houses dotted the landscape, no curl of smoke from a neighbor's chimney, no glint of a passing car on a distant road. The silence he had noticed earlier was no longer peaceful or novel. It was predatory, a vast, crushing emptiness, that swallowed all sound. He could hear the faint buzz of insects, the whisper of wind through the tall grass, and the frantic pounding of his own heart. The taxi was long gone. The sound of its engine, their final link to the world, had faded into nothingness, leaving them utterly and terrifyingly alone. He had never felt so isolated, so completely cut off from humanity. He looked down at Sophia, who was now awake and staring at the ruin, her small face a heartbreaking canvas of confusion and dawning fear. The grand adventure he had promised her had evaporated, revealed as a cruel and desperate lie. She looked up at him, her big brown eyes swimming with questions she didn't know how to ask, her trust in him beginning to crack. In that moment, all the air went out of his lungs. The hope that had briefly flickered inside him was violently, brutally extinguished, replaced by a despair so profound it was a physical weight, threatening to crush him right there in the overgrown weeds. In the city, he had been at the end of his rope. Here, he had used that rope to lead his child into a fresh hell, a nightmare of his own making. His heart didn't just sink. It felt as if it had shattered into a million ice-cold fragments. He had thought he had hit bottom in that apartment. He was wrong. This was the bottom. The first few days were a blur of back-breaking, spirit-crushing labor. Daniel worked from the first weak light of dawn until his muscles screamed in protest, under a sky full of indifferent stars. His world shrank to the immediate, punishing tasks of survival. He focused on a single room, the one with the least damage. Prying up rotten floorboards and patching the largest holes in the wall with scrap wood, he scavenged from the collapsed sections of the house. The air was constantly thick with the fine, choking dust of decay, a powder that coated his tongue and grated in his lungs with every breath. He could hear the house settling around them, a constant symphony of groans, creaks, and the dry, unnerving skittering of unseen creatures within the walls. Each sound was a reminder of their precarious position, a testament to the immense, overwhelming task ahead. His initial despair had settled into a dull, leaden resignation. He felt his spirit being ground down, just like the old wood he was tearing apart. This wasn't building. It was just delaying the inevitable collapse. Sophia had grown quiet, a small shadow flitting at the edges of his desperate activity. The bright, adventurous spirit he had seen at the bus station had been extinguished by the grim reality of their new home. She spent hours sitting on a relatively clean patch of floor, drawing pictures in the dust with her finger, her face a mask of solemn concentration. He tried to engage her, to conjure up some of the false cheerfulness from their journey, but the words felt hollow and dishonest in his own mouth. He felt a constant, sharp ache of guilt every time he looked at her. He had brought her to this ruin. He had replaced the familiar sounds of her city life, the distant laughter from the playground, the jingle of the ice cream truck, with the oppressive silence of the wild and the chilling whispers of a dying house. The hope he had sold her had been a poison, and he could see its effects in her withdrawn posture and the sad, distant look that now lived in her eyes. His heart cracked a little more each time their gazes met. By the fourth day, they had made one small room marginally habitable. A tarp covered the biggest hole in the roof. Their 2 sleeping bags were laid out on a floor he had swept clean of the worst debris, and a small fire in the stone hearth provided a flickering light and a fragile warmth against the surprising chill of the country nights. The smoke, thick with the scent of pine, was the only thing that could temporarily mask the house's pervasive smell of rot. Daniel would sit by the fire long after Sophia had fallen into a restless sleep, listening to the night. The sounds were alien to him, the mournful hoot of an owl, the frantic chirping of crickets, and sometimes a strange guttural cry from deep in the woods that made the hair on his arms stand up. He felt like a trespasser in an ancient, forgotten kingdom, a place with its own rules and dangers he couldn't begin to comprehend. His loneliness was a physical presence, sitting beside him in the dark, as cold and solid as the stones of the fireplace. With one room secured, his attention turned to the rest of the house. He needed more materials, more space, and a better understanding of the structure's decay. At the end of a dark, narrow hallway, there was a door that was different from the others. While the rest were either missing or hung crookedly on their hinges, this one was firmly shut, its edges sealed with what looked like decades of dust and grime. It seemed deliberately closed off, a primal curiosity, the first emotion besides despair he'd felt in days, began to stir within him. Why was this one room sealed? His carpenter's hands ran over the old wood, feeling its solidness. He tried the tarnished brass knob, but it wouldn't turn. It was locked or jammed shut. He pushed against the door with his shoulder, putting his weight into it. The frame groaned in protest, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the silent house, but the door held fast, guarding whatever secrets lay within its dusty confines. He would not be deterred. This small, mundane mystery was a welcome distraction from the larger, unsolvable problem of his life. He retrieved his crowbar, the same tool he'd used to pry up the rotten floorboards. The heavy, cold steel felt solid and purposeful in his hand. He wedged its flattened tip into the crack between the door and the frame, just above the lock. He took a deep breath, the dusty air filling his lungs, and pushed down with all his might. The sound was explosive in the silence, a sharp, violent crack as the old lock mechanism shattered and the wood of the jamb splintered. The door swung inward with a low, mournful groan, like a sigh of release. A wave of air, unimaginably stale and utterly still, washed over him. It was the scent of a space that hadn't breathed in a very, very long time. It was the smell of trapped air, of undisturbed dust, and something else, something fainter, that he couldn't quite place. He stood at the threshold, peering into the gloom, a sense of trespass prickling his skin. The room was a time capsule. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes of dust, streamed through a single grimy window that had miraculously remained intact, illuminating a scene of suspended animation. All the furniture, a tall wardrobe, a vanity with a clouded mirror, an ornate iron bed frame, was draped in white dust cloths, their forms transformed into ghostly, silent sentinels. The layer of dust on every surface was thick and uniform, a grey, velvety blanket that had been laid down over decades, completely undisturbed. There were no signs of the animal intrusion or water damage that plagued the rest of the house. It was as if this room had been meticulously prepared and then sealed away from the world, left to slumber while the rest of the house rotted around it. The sight filled Daniel with a strange sense of reverence and an even deeper sense of unease. This wasn't just neglect. This felt intentional. This was a tomb, not a bedroom. He felt his heart begin to beat a little faster, a nervous rhythm in the profound quiet. He motioned for Sophia to stay by the doorway, a sudden protective instinct flaring up. He stepped inside, his boots leaving dark, clear prints in the pale grey dust, the first marks of intrusion in what felt like a lifetime. He ran a hand over a shrouded nightstand, the dust cool and soft as silk under his calloused fingers. He was just absorbing the strangeness of it all when Sophia's voice, small and timid from the hallway, cut through the silence. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Why does it smell like Mommy's pretty flowers in here?" The question struck Daniel like a physical blow. His mind, so overwhelmed by the dominant stench of dust and old wood, had filtered out anything else, and the mention of his wife, of her perfume, here in this place of decay, sent a sharp, painful jolt straight through his heart. It was a cruel trick of the mind, a phantom scent conjured by grief and stress. It had to be. He could feel the familiar tightness in his chest, the grief that was always lurking just below the surface, now raw and exposed. "It's just the old wood. Honey," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Sometimes old things have a sweet smell." He didn't turn to look at her, afraid she would see the sudden, sharp pain in his eyes. He couldn't deal with this right now. He couldn't handle the ghost of his wife's memory appearing in this God-forsaken place. He needed to focus on the tangible, on the wood and the dust, not on the impossible, heartbreaking phantoms of his daughter's imagination. He dismissed her comment, pushing it away with a force born of pure emotional self-preservation. It was dust, it was rot, it was the smell of a sealed room. Anything else was a lie, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and sorrow. He took a deep breath, deliberately trying to fill his lungs with the scent of decay, to ground himself in the grim reality of the house and banish the dangerous spectre of a familiar perfume. But his brusque dismissal did nothing to quiet the uneasy feeling that had taken root in his gut. He moved further into the room, his boots crunching softly in the thick dust, making his way towards the large iron bed frame that dominated the space. His plan was to dismantle it, to see if the metal could be repurposed or sold for scrap, another small, desperate act in his battle for survival. He reached for the heavy dust cloth that covered the mattress, his mind already calculating the weight of the iron, the effort it would take to break it down. He was a carpenter, a man of practicalities, and he forced his thoughts back into that familiar, solid territory. He grabbed a corner of the cloth, the fabric stiff and brittle with age. As he prepared to pull it away, to disturb the final sleeping giant in this silent room, a faint, almost imperceptible scent wafted up to him, released from the disturbed air, and he froze. His hand, clutching the dusty sheet, went completely still. His entire body locked in place, every muscle tensed. It was impossible, utterly, completely impossible, but it was there. It was jasmine, faint, ethereal, and utterly unmistakable. It was the exact scent of the expensive perfume his wife had loved, the one she saved for special occasions, a fragrance so deeply intertwined with his happiest memories that smelling it now felt like a violation. A powerful shiver, born not of cold but of pure, superstitious shock, traveled up his spine and exploded at the base of his skull. His heart, which had been beating with a nervous rhythm, now began to pound against his ribs with a frantic, terrified force. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. His rational mind screamed that it couldn't be real. Scents faded, perfume evaporated, yet here it was, a ghostly whisper in a room sealed for half a century, floating beneath the heavy, oppressive blanket of dust and decay. He dropped the sheet, his hand flying to his mouth as if to stifle a cry. He felt like he was losing his mind, that the grief and the isolation were finally fracturing his sanity. He was hallucinating. He had to be. But Sophia had smelled it too. The thought cut through his panic with the sharp clarity of a razor blade. A child's senses were pure, unburdened by grief or psychological stress. If she smelled it, it was real. The realization didn't calm him. It terrified him on a much deeper level. This wasn't a ghost in his mind. It was a physical phenomenon in this room, a mystery that defied all logic. His survival instinct, which had been focused on shelter and food, suddenly shifted. A new, more primal drive took over, the need to understand. The exhaustion fell away from him, replaced by a surge of nervous, focused energy. The house was no longer just a ruin to be endured. It was a puzzle to be solved. He felt his breathing become shallow and quick. He was no longer just a desperate father trying to fix a roof. He was an investigator who had just stumbled upon his first impossible clue. The despair that had been his constant companion was momentarily forgotten, shoved aside by a thrilling and terrifying curiosity. He crouched down, his movements now slow and deliberate. Like an archaeologist at a delicate dig site, he inhaled deeply, trying to pinpoint the source of the phantom scent. It was stronger here, closer to the floor, near the foot of the heavy iron bed. He got down on his hands and knees, ignoring the filth and the way the rough wood scraped against his palms. The dust was so thick here it was like a fine grey sand. He crawled forward, his nose just inches from the floorboards, feeling utterly ridiculous but driven by an undeniable compulsion. The scent of jasmine was definitely concentrated in this one specific area, a ghostly floral bloom in the desert of decay. He ran his hand over the floorboards, his carpenter's sense of touch taking over. His fingers, trained to detect the slightest imperfection in wood, brushed over the familiar roughness of age and neglect, and then something else. Something was wrong. His fingers stopped, tracing the edges of a single plank. It was almost imperceptible to the eye, hidden by the uniform layer of dust, but his fingertips told him the truth. One floorboard sat just a fraction of an inch higher than its neighbors. The seams on either side of it were too clean, too perfect. While the surrounding boards were warped and slightly cupped with age, this one was perfectly flat. His carpenter's brain, which had been dormant under the weight of his despair, roared to life. This wasn't natural decay, this was craftsmanship. Someone had cut this board out and replaced it with meticulous care. Someone had wanted to hide the seam. His gaze followed the length of the board. It ran directly under the heaviest part of the iron bed frame, a deliberate placement. No one would ever move a bed that heavy unless they had a very specific reason. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was the thrill of discovery, the intoxicating moment when a hidden detail reveals a larger, secret design. "Sophia, go wait in the other room for me," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. He didn't want her here for what came next. He didn't know what he was about to find, but a dark, powerful intuition told him it was something private, something heavy. He waited until he heard her small footsteps retreating down the hall before he turned his full attention back to the bed. It was old, solid iron, and incredibly heavy. He gripped the footboard, the cold metal biting into his palms. He planted his feet, bent his knees, and lifted with a guttural grunt of effort, his back muscles screaming in protest. The legs of the bed scraped across the dusty floor with a deafening, high-pitched screech, a sound that seemed to violate the ancient silence of the room. He managed to drag it just a few feet, enough to expose the full length of the suspect floorboard. There, revealed in the now unobstructed space, was a small, almost invisible notch cut into one end of the plank, a hidden finger pull. He didn't have the right tools, only the brutal force of the crowbar. He fetched it again, his heart hammering against his ribs in a wild, frantic rhythm. He felt a strange mix of exhilaration and a deep, encroaching dread. He was about to cross a threshold, to unearth a secret that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the small notch, the metal-on-wood contact feeling unnervingly intimate. He took a steadying breath and leveraged the bar downwards. There was no splintering this time. Instead, the entire board lifted smoothly, silently, on hidden, well-oiled hinges he hadn't seen. The craftsmanship was beautiful, precise. It was the work of a master carpenter. It was the kind of work he himself had once aspired to. Beneath the lifted board lay a perfectly cut rectangular void, a dark, gaping mouth in the subfloor. The space was lined with cedar planks, their clean, sharp scent mingling strangely with the impossible jasmine. This was a secret compartment, a hiding place. He knelt, peering into the darkness. His eyes adjusted, and he could make out the shape of an object nestled within the cedar-lined space. It was a box, dark and unassuming. A profound sense of anticipation, so powerful it was almost painful, seized him. This was it, the culmination of the impossible scent, the hidden board, the secret craftsmanship. For one wild, desperate moment, he allowed himself to hope for a miracle. Money, gold, something that could solve his problems, that could buy them a future. That could justify this insane gamble. His hands trembled as he reached into the compartment, the raw hope making him feel dizzy. His fingers brushed against something cool, smooth, and incredibly dense. It was heavy, far heavier than an empty wooden box should be. He gripped it with both hands, the weight surprising him, and lifted it out of its hiding place, setting it carefully on the dusty floor beside him. It was a small chest, no bigger than a shoebox, but it was bound in what looked like lead. He stared at the lead-lined box, a chill crawling over his skin despite the stuffy air in the room. Why lead? The question echoed in his mind. Lead was used to block things, to shield, to contain. A sudden, irrational fear gripped him. What if it wasn't meant to keep people out, but to keep something in? He examined the box, his hands tracing its strange, heavy form. It was sealed with a simple but sturdy iron latch, green with a fine patina of age. There was no lock. He looked at the box, then at the empty compartment, then around the silent, ghostly room. He felt as though he was not alone, as though the person who built this hiding place was standing right behind him, holding their breath, waiting for him to open it. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the weight of a 50-year-old secret. The initial thrill of the hunt was now completely overshadowed by a deep, somber sense of gravity. He was no longer just an intruder. He was about to become a keeper of this secret himself. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart, he placed his thumbs under the old iron latch. It was stiff, frozen in place by time. He pushed, his knuckles turning white with the strain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, loud click that made him jump, the latch sprang open. The sound was like a key turning in a lock that hadn't been opened in generations. He hesitated for a final, long second, his hand hovering over the lid. This was the point of no return. Once he saw what was inside, he could never unsee it. The secret would become his. The weight of it would be his to carry. He thought of Sophia, waiting in the other room, her entire world resting on his shoulders. He thought of his crushing debt and the ruin that surrounded him. What other choice did he have? He had to know, he had to see this through to the end. He closed his fingers around the edge of the heavy lid, and with a final surge of resolve, he lifted it open. The first thing that hit him was the scent. The faint, ghostly whisper of jasmine that had lured him here was now an overwhelming, intoxicating wave of pure fragrance. It poured out of the box like a visible cloud, a scent so perfectly preserved, it felt like a physical presence in the room. It was the smell of life, of beauty, of memory, impossibly captured and held in this leaden tomb. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior of the box, and the wild hope of finding gold or cash died a swift, silent death. There was no glint of metal, no stacks of currency. His heart sank with a familiar, bitter pang of disappointment. The miracle had not arrived, but what he saw instead was, in its own way, even more astonishing. The source of the scent was immediately clear. Resting on a bed of what looked like yellowed papers was a single, pressed jasmine flower. It was faded, its petals the color of old ivory, but it was perfectly, miraculously intact. He reached in with a trembling hand, his rough fingers feeling clumsy and profane as he touched the delicate, papery petals of the preserved flower. It was as light as a whisper, the fragile ghost of a summer that had ended long ago. He lifted it out, holding it in his palm. The fragrance clung to it, a powerful, concentrated memory. Who would go to such lengths to preserve a single flower? Who would build such an elaborate hiding place for something so ephemeral, so financially worthless? This wasn't the treasure he had hoped for, but he recognized instantly that it was a treasure nonetheless. It was a treasure of sentiment, of a love or a memory so powerful that someone had sought to make it immortal, to seal it away from the ravages of time itself. He felt a profound sense of sorrow, a deep, aching empathy for the unknown person who had hidden this away. This box wasn't meant to protect a fortune, it was meant to protect a heart. Beneath the flower lay the rest of the contents. On top was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. A diary. The leather was supple and cool to the touch. It felt impossibly personal, a vessel containing someone's innermost thoughts, fears, and dreams. The very idea of opening it, of reading the private words of a stranger, felt like a profound violation. Yet, the need to understand was a magnetic pull he couldn't resist. The mystery of the jasmine, of the sealed room, of this house, the answers were almost certainly contained within these pages. The diary was a key, and he had to turn it. His gaze dropped to the final item in the box. It was a stack of letters, perhaps 24 of them, neatly bundled and tied with a simple ribbon. The ribbon, which might have once been a vibrant red or pink, had faded over the decades to a pale, ghostly rose color, a fragile band holding a silent conversation together. He carefully lifted the diary from the box. It was heavier than it looked, weighted with the density of its pages and the secrets they held. There was no name on the cover, no inscription. It was anonymous, yet intensely intimate. He let the book fall open in his hands to a random page. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and covered in a tight, elegant cursive script. The ink, a dark blue, was slightly faded but perfectly legible. It was a woman's handwriting, graceful and controlled. He didn't read the words, not yet. He just stared at the pattern of the script, the loops and swirls of the letters forming a language he was not yet meant to understand. This was a life, a whole life, condensed and captured and buried in the floor of his ancestral home. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the silent voice of the diary's author. He felt a deep, almost spiritual sense of responsibility settle over him. He was no longer just Daniel, the failed carpenter. He was now the custodian of this story. Next, he turned his attention to the bundle of letters. He picked them up, the faded ribbon feeling fragile under his fingers. The envelopes were addressed in the same elegant script as the diary, but the recipient's name was what made his breath catch in his throat. Elias, the name of his great-uncle, the man who had left him this ruined farm. Suddenly, the disparate pieces of the puzzle began to connect in his mind. The sealed room, the hidden box, the diary, it all belonged to his great-uncle's past. This wasn't some random stranger's story. It was a part of his own family's history, a secret that had been deliberately and meticulously buried. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This was a family secret, and family secrets, he knew, were often buried for a reason. They were hidden because they were dangerous, because they were painful, because their revelation could shatter the present. He was holding a ghost, a piece of his family's forgotten and perhaps forbidden past. He placed the diary and the letters carefully on the floor beside the lead-lined box. The room was now a crime scene, and he was the sole detective. The open loops of the mystery swirled in his mind, each question giving birth to another. Who was the woman who wrote this diary? What was her relationship to his great-uncle Elias? Why was her memory, her scent, her very essence, sealed away in this room with such desperate care? And why, after all these years, was the scent of jasmine still so powerfully, impossibly present? The house was no longer just a physical wreck. It was a psychological maze, and he was standing right at its center. The despair over his financial ruin and homelessness hadn't vanished, but it was now joined by a new, more compelling force. He had a purpose beyond mere survival. He had to uncover the truth. He had to give a voice to the silent woman whose memory had called out to him and his daughter from across the decades. Daniel sat back on his heels, the dust motes dancing in the slanted beams of light around him. He looked at the evidence laid out before him, the flower, the diary, the letters. This was not a treasure of gold that could buy him a new life. He knew that now. This was something far more complicated. It was a treasure of truth, a currency of secrets. And he had a growing, chilling premonition that this truth, once unearthed, would be far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous than any amount of money. The house had given up its first secret, but in doing so, it had ensnared him in a story that was not his own. The profound silence of the room seemed to press in on him, no longer empty, but filled with unanswered questions and the palpable weight of a life lived and lost within these walls. He reached for the diary, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. His own desperate story had just collided with another, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that neither would ever be the same again. With Sophia finally asleep, a small, trusting lump under the thin wool blanket, Daniel felt the true weight of the night press in. The only light came from the small, sputtering fire he'd built in the hearth, its flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that made the ruined room feel alive and menacing. He sat on the dusty floor, the cold seeping through his worn jeans, and placed the lead-lined box beside him. His heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a grave robber, about to disturb the sacred rest of the dead. With hands that trembled, he lifted the leather-bound diary. The material was cool and supple, worn smooth by a hand that had held it countless times. He could almost feel the phantom warmth of its owner. He took a shaky breath, the air thick with the smell of old paper, pine smoke, and the faint, ghostly perfume of jasmine, and opened the book to the very first page. The script was beautiful, a graceful, flowing cursive that spoke of education and a gentle spirit. And at the top of the page, two words that made the story real: Ilara, 1974. He began to read, his eyes devouring the elegant script under the fire's unsteady light. The early entries were filled with a palpable sense of fear, the claustrophobia of hiding, the constant terror of a sudden noise, a car on the distant road. Yet, interwoven with the fear was a poet's appreciation for her prison. Ilara wrote of the beauty of the sunrise over the wild fields, the kindness in his great-uncle Elias's quiet, watchful eyes. Daniel felt a strange and powerful kinship with her. She was trapped by a brutal political regime. He was trapped by poverty. Both of them had found a fragile, flawed sanctuary in this same isolated place. A deep, aching empathy bloomed in his chest. Elias was described not as a simple farmer, but as a man of quiet, profound courage, a man who risked everything to shelter her. A confusing mix of pride and sorrow washed over Daniel. This was his family, this quiet heroism and this buried fear. It was his inheritance. As he turned the pages, devouring weeks, then months of Ilara's hidden life, the diary's focus began to subtly shift. Her initial fear of the regime's soldiers was slowly replaced by a more specific, localized anxiety. She started writing about the land itself, not just as a refuge, but as something more. She mentioned conversations she overheard. Elias's constant, gnawing worry about the outspring at the north edge, a water source Daniel hadn't even known existed. "Elias says it is the lifeblood of this entire valley," she wrote. "He says it is why he wants this land so badly." The pronoun was italicized, sharp and deliberate. Reading her words, Daniel felt his own stomach tighten in a knot. The vague sense of unease that had settled over him since finding the box was sharpening into a specific, targeted dread. This wasn't just about a political fugitive. It was about something more primal: greed. The source of that greed was soon given a name. Elara began to write about the neighbor, a man she referred to only as the doctor. Her description sent a chill crawling up Daniel's spine. She wrote of watching him from her hidden window, seeing him visit Elias under the pretense of neighborly concern. "His eyes," she wrote, "are like chips of cold stone. They see everything and feel nothing." She detailed his repeated, condescendingly low offers to buy the farm, his unnerving obsession with the property. More terrifyingly, she wrote of his connections. He was a vocal supporter of the military dictatorship, a man who bragged about his friendships with high-ranking officers. The local authorities, she noted, seemed to treat him with a mixture of deference and pure fear. Daniel felt a wave of cold realization wash over him. The diary was no longer just the sad story of a political victim. It was a thriller, and the villain was not some distant, faceless government, but a man who lived right next door. His hands shaking, Daniel put the diary down and carefully untied the faded ribbon from the stack of letters. They weren't letters to Elara, but from Elias. Notes he must have written and passed to her by hand. A silent conversation within the confines of the house. His simple, blocky handwriting was a stark contrast to her elegant script, but the words carried a desperate weight. Elias's fear was a raw, open wound on the page. He wrote of the doctor's escalating pressure, his visits becoming more frequent, his questions more pointed. "He knows you are here." One terrifying letter read, the words pressing hard into the paper. "I can see it in his eyes. He smells weakness like a vulture circling a dying animal. He spoke of the weeds that need pulling from the garden of our nation. He was talking about you." Daniel felt a surge of nausea. He could feel his great-uncle's terror reaching across the decades, a cold sweat breaking out on his own forehead. He picked up the diary again, his fingers fumbling as he turned to the final entry. The date was stark and clear. October 12th, 1974. The handwriting was almost unrecognizable. The elegant, controlled script was gone, replaced by a frantic, jagged scrawl that barely stayed on the lines. It was the writing of pure terror. "Elias is gone to town for supplies. The doctor is here. He came to the front door. He said he knows everything. I hear him walking around outside now. He said he isn't here for the regime. He wants the water. He said it's a shame when accidents happen out in the country." The entry stopped abruptly. It didn't end. It was cut off, a final, desperate line of ink trailing off the page as if the pen had been torn from her hand. Daniel stared at the page, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The silence of the house rushed in, vast and deafening. His heart didn't just pound, it felt as if it had stopped completely. The full, monstrous horror of the story slammed into Daniel with the force of a physical blow. He pieced it together in a sickening, instantaneous flash of insight. The doctor, the neighbor, he had murdered her. It wasn't the dictatorship. It was one man, a single, greedy individual who coveted the farm for its water. He had used his position as a military informant, a patriot in the eyes of the regime, to provide the perfect cover story. He killed Elara and made it look like a state-sanctioned political disappearance. Then, he used that very act of terror to silence Elias, to trap him in a prison of guilt and fear for the rest of his life. Elias couldn't go to the police. The doctor was the police. The sheer calculated evil of it, the cold-blooded twisting of a national tragedy for personal gain, made Daniel's stomach heave. He scrambled to the broken window, gasping for air, the bitter taste of bile rising in his throat. It was then that a sound from outside tore through the night, a sound so alien and out of place that it seemed to rip the fabric of reality. The distinct crunch of tires rolling slowly over gravel and dry leaves. Daniel's heart leaped into his throat, a hot metallic taste of fear flooding his mouth. No one came down this road. It led to nowhere but this ruin. A blindingly white, modern light sliced through the darkness. cutting a sharp path across the dilapidated walls of the room and illuminating the swirling dust in the air. A large, expensive-looking truck, impossibly clean and new, pulled to a stop just beyond the sagging porch. The engine was cut, and the world was plunged back into a silence that now felt heavy, predatory, and deeply personal. Every nerve in Daniel's body screamed. He wasn't just reading about the monster anymore. The monster was here. The truck door opened and closed with a solid, confident thump that spoke of wealth and power. Then came the sound of footsteps on the overgrown path, heavy, unhurried, the walk of a man who believes the ground he walks on belongs to him. Daniel scrambled back from the window, his mind racing. He shoved the diary and letters back into the lead box, slid it under his sleeping bag, and pulled the thin blanket over it, his movements frantic and clumsy. He stood frozen in the shadows, his breath held tight and painful in his chest. The footsteps stopped. A man cleared his throat, a deep, rumbling sound of authority. Then a voice cut through the night, a voice that was smooth, educated, and utterly chilling. "Hello, the house," it called out, a mockery of a friendly greeting. "I saw your light. Just a neighbor wanting to welcome you to the area." The voice was pleasant, but it struck Daniel with the force of a physical blow. It was the voice of a predator circling its prey. Daniel knew he couldn't hide. That would be an admission of fear, a confirmation of suspicion. He forced his leaden feet to move, stepping out from the relative darkness of the room onto the moonlit ruin of the porch. He squinted against the glare of the truck's headlights, which the man had left on. A clear power move. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the beams. As Daniel's eyes adjusted, the figure resolved into a man in his late 70s, impeccably dressed in a pressed shirt and jacket, his white hair perfectly combed. He stepped forward, his face becoming clear. It was a face of stern, aristocratic authority, marked by a life of unquestioned power. He extended a hand, a thin, reptilian smile on his lips. "Dr. Rocha," he announced, his voice the same smooth baritone from the darkness. "I own all the surrounding land. Your great-uncle and I were acquaintances." Daniel felt a jolt of pure ice water shoot through his veins. It was him, the doctor. He was shaking the hand of a murderer. Daniel's own hand felt clammy and weak as he took Rocha's. The doctor's grip was firm, dry, and as cold as the stone Ilara had described. "Daniel," he managed to choke out, his voice sounding distant and thin to his own ears, "just arrived." Rocha's eyes, sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth, did a slow, dismissive sweep of the dilapidated farmhouse before landing on Daniel. The look was one of profound condescension, an assessment of weakness. "A monumental task you have here," Rocha said, his voice dripping with a false, syrupy sympathy that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Elias let this place go completely to ruin years ago. A very sad business. He was never quite right, you know. Not after the troubles back in the 70s. The words were dropped into the conversation, like stones into a still pond, each one creating a ripple of unspoken threat. "Look," Rocha said, his tone shifting abruptly, the thin veneer of neighborly concern evaporating. "I'll be blunt. This land is a worthless wreck. It's isolated, the house is a teardown, and to be frank, it has an unfortunate history. Bad memories have a way of clinging to a place like this." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and produced a checkbook, the gesture smooth and practiced. "I want it. To consolidate my holdings, I will give you $10,000. Cash. Right now. You take your little girl and be on the first bus back to the city tomorrow morning. A fresh start. Forget this godforsaken place ever existed." The offer was a calculated insult, a sum so low it was laughable. Daniel understood instantly. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a test to see if he knew the land's true value, the secret of the water. A tempest of cold fury and raw terror raged inside Daniel. $10,000. For land that held the key to an entire valley's water supply, for land that held the bones of a murdered woman. He could feel the weight of Ilara's diary, a secret burning under his sleeping bag just a few feet away. He felt her ghost at his shoulder. Screaming for justice, he jammed his hands into his pockets to hide their violent trembling. He had to play the part of the fool. His life, and more importantly, Sophia's life, depended on it. I appreciate the offer, Dr. Rocha," he said, forcing his voice into a mask of weary gratitude. "But I need some time to think it over. I just got here. I need to at least see what I'm dealing with." He prayed it sounded convincing, that the terror wasn't leaking through his voice. Dr. Roach's smile dissolved. It did not fade. It vanished, as if it had been a mask that was instantly dropped. His eyes, those cold chips of stone, narrowed into slits. For a single, terrifying second, Daniel saw the monster from the diary, a flash of pure, undisguised menace, a predator's murderous rage. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by an expression of paternalistic concern that was even more horrifying. "Don't think too long, son," Rocha said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial purr, a sound far more threatening than any shout. "This is a treacherous old place. Rotting wood, unstable ground. Things break, people get careless." He paused, letting the words sink in, his gaze boring into Daniel. "Accidents happen all the time to people who dig around in things that are better left buried." He turned sharply, his back rigid, and walked back to his truck, the threat left hanging in the cold night air like a razor blade held to Daniel's throat. Daniel remained frozen on the porch, his body rigid, long after the red tail lights of Rocha's truck had been swallowed by the immense darkness. The only sound was the frantic, roaring pulse of blood in his ears. The night air, which had before felt merely cold, now felt thick with malice, meek as alive with danger. He was no longer just a desperate father fighting poverty. He was now a witness, the sole keeper of a 50-year-old secret, and the murderer knew he had it. The diary was no longer a historical artifact, it was a death warrant. He looked back at the dark, gaping doorway of the ruin where Sophia slept, safe for now in her innocence, completely unaware that a monster had just stood on their doorstep. He held the power to bring justice for Ilara, but the cost could be his own life and his daughter's. He was trapped between the ghosts of the past and the very real threat of the present. What would you do in his place? Would you take the money and run, saving your child but burying the truth forever? Or would you risk everything for a justice that was never promised? The silence Rocha left behind was a living entity, a thick, suffocating blanket woven with menace. Daniel stood on the collapsing porch, his body locked in a state of primal fear, his muscles screaming with the urge to run, yet his feet felt as if they were nailed to the rotting wood. Every familiar night sound was now twisted into a threat. The hoot of an owl was a harbinger of doom. The rustle of leaves in the wind was the sound of approaching footsteps. The frantic chirping of crickets was a chorus of tiny alarm bells he couldn't shut off. He felt naked, exposed, a target painted on his back. Rocha's final words, "Accidents happen," echoed in his mind, not as a whisper, but as a deafening shout. The cold night air didn't just feel chilly, it felt predatory, clinging to his skin with the damp, unwelcome touch of a shroud. His heart was a wild bird trapped in his ribcage, beating its wings against his bones in a desperate, useless panic. He was no longer just poor and desperate, he was hunted. The scale of his peril had shifted from financial ruin to mortal danger, and the isolation he once lamented had become a terrifying vulnerability. Slowly, his paralysis broke. The image of Sophia's sleeping face flashed in his mind, a beacon of clarity in the fog of his terror. The fear for himself was nothing compared to the white-hot, protective rage that surged through him. He was a father. That was his only true identity now. He turned and slipped back into the dark room, his movements silent and deliberate. He knelt by Sophia's sleeping bag, his hand hovering over her, needing to feel the warmth of her breath, to confirm her reality in this waking nightmare. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, innocent rhythm, completely unaware of the monster who had just stood at their door. A terrible resolve hardened in Daniel's chest, solidifying from the liquid fear. He would not be the next accident. He would not let this place, this story, consume his daughter. He was no longer just the keeper of Ilara's secret. He was its guardian, and he would protect it with the same ferocity with which he would protect his child. Rocha had made a fatal error. He hadn't just threatened a broken man, he had threatened a father, and a father had nothing left to lose. Sleep was an impossibility. Daniel sat with his back against the cold stone of the fireplace, the lead box heavy on his lap, the crowbar resting within arm's reach. The fire had died down to glowing, pulsing embers that cast a hellish red light on the crumbling walls. He felt like a soldier on watch in enemy territory, every sense stretched to its breaking point. He replayed Rocha's visit over and over, dissecting every word, every gesture, every subtle shift in his cold, reptilian eyes. The condescending offer, the veiled threats, the chilling mention of his great-uncle's madness. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to terrify and intimidate. Daniel felt the weight of the diary in the box, a tangible link to Ilara, to his uncle Elias, to the decades of silent suffering that had soaked into the very soil of this farm. He was not alone in the room. He felt the presence of their ghosts, not as terrifying specters, but as silent allies, their fear and their courage fueling his own fragile resolve against the encroaching darkness outside. The sun rose the next morning, not as a promise of a new day, but as a giant, indifferent spotlight, revealing his prison in stark, unforgiving detail. The golden light that streamed through the broken windows did nothing to warm the profound chill that had settled deep in his bones. He felt trapped, a castaway on an island surrounded by a sea of land owned by his enemy. Every direction he looked, he saw Rocha's territory. Every path out led through the wolf's domain. He made coffee over the fire, the bitter, smoky smell, a small, familiar comfort, in a world that had become utterly alien. He watched Sophia wake, a knot of guilt tightening in his stomach. How could he keep her safe here? His mind raced, searching for an escape route, a plan, any option other than crawling back to Rocha and accepting his insulting, blood-soaked offer. But there was nowhere to go. No money for a bus, no one to call, no sanctuary to run to. The farm was both the source of his danger and his only refuge. It was an impossible, maddening paradox that threatened to shatter his sanity. Later that morning, as he was attempting to reinforce the rotted frame of the back window, a movement on the horizon caught his eye. His body went rigid, his blood turning to ice. A figure, a lone man, walking slowly but purposefully across the open field, heading directly for the farmhouse. Panic seized him. It was one of Rocha's men, he was sure of it. A scout sent to assess their position, or worse. He dropped the hammer, the clang of metal on wood echoing with startling loudness. "Sophia," he hissed, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Inside. Now. And be quiet." He shoved her gently toward the relative safety of the main room and grabbed the heavy crowbar, his knuckles white as he gripped the cold steel. He flattened himself against the exterior wall, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm in his ears, his breath held tight in his chest. He peered through a crack in the warped siding, watching the approaching figure. This was it. The confrontation was coming. He braced himself, ready to fight, ready to die for the small, silent girl hiding inside. As the figure drew closer, Daniel's terror began to morph into confusion. This was not the kind of man a wealthy landowner like Rocha would employ as a henchman. The man was old, ancient even, his back bent into a permanent, sorrowful curve. He walked with a pronounced, painful-looking limp, using a gnarled wooden staff as a makeshift cane. He was thin, almost skeletal, and his clothes were a patchwork of faded, mended fabrics. His face, and when he was close enough for Daniel to see, was a roadmap of deep wrinkles, a testament to a long, hard life lived under the unforgiving sun. His hair was a wild shock of white, and his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to hold a profound, weary sadness. He stopped 100 feet from the house, leaning heavily on his staff, and simply stood there, staring at the ruin as if he were looking at a ghost. The man radiated not menace, but an immense, palpable sorrow. Daniel felt the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction, the adrenaline of imminent combat replaced by a wary, intense curiosity. Who was this old man? The man lifted a trembling hand, not in greeting, but as if to shield his eyes, though the sun was behind him. His voice, and when it came in, was thin and reedy, carried on the wind like a dry leaf. "I saw his truck," the old man called out, his words clear and sharp despite their frailness. "I saw the doctor's truck here last night." The name, the doctor, spoken aloud by another, sent a fresh jolt of fear through Daniel. This man knew Rocha. "I knew this day would come," the man continued, his voice cracking with an emotion Daniel couldn't quite place. Fear, regret, or perhaps something else entirely, ever since I heard Elias was gone. I knew whoever came next would have to face him. He took a few more limping steps forward, his gaze fixed on Daniel's hiding spot, as if he could see him right through the walls. "I am Matteo. Elias. Elias was my only friend." The confession hung in the air, simple, heartbreaking, and utterly disarming. It was not a threat, but an offering. An olive branch extended across a field of fear. Slowly, cautiously, Daniel lowered the crowbar. His instincts, screaming at him to stay hidden just moments before, were now telling him something different. This was not a threat. This was something else. He took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the wall into the full light of day. The old man, Matteo, flinched slightly at his sudden appearance but held his ground. Up close, his eyes were even more haunted, deep-set and filled with a lifetime of unspoken burdens. "I'm Daniel," he said, his voice hoarse. "Elias was my great-uncle." Matteo nodded slowly, a flicker of something, recognition, pity in his ancient eyes. "I know," he said softly. "You have his face, the same worry in the brow." A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. It was a silence of mutual assessment, two strangers on a desolate island, trying to decide if the other was a fellow castaway or a predator in disguise. Daniel felt a fragile, desperate hope begin to stir. He was no longer entirely alone. "Rocha paid you a visit," Matteo stated, "not a question. He made you an offer, told you the land was worthless, told you accidents happen." The words were so precise, so exactly what had transpired, that Daniel could only stare, speechless. It was as if Matteo had been standing on the porch with them the night before. "He hasn't changed," Matteo continued, his voice dropping to a low, bitter murmur. "More for himself than for Daniel. 50 years, and the devil is still the devil. He just got older, richer." He spat on the ground, a gesture of profound, ancient contempt. Elias was a good man, a brave man, but Rocha broke him. He filled this place with ghosts and left Elias to live with them. He was never the same after she was gone. The casual mention of she landed like a physical blow. Daniel's heart began to pound again, a heavy, urgent rhythm. This old man knew. He knew the whole story. He wasn't just a neighbor, he was a part of it. He was the guardian of the story. "What do you know?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper, the question feeling enormous, dangerous. Who was she? Matteo's gaze drifted from Daniel to the ruined farmhouse, a profound sadness clouding his features. "Her name was Ilara," he said, the name spoken with a strange reverence, as if it were a prayer. "She was full of life, like one of those birds from the south, all bright colors and beautiful songs, trapped in a winter cage." He sighed, a long, rattling sound deep in his chest. Elias was trying to save her, trying to do the right thing in a world that had gone completely wrong. But this land is cursed with more than just rot and bad memories. It's cursed with water, and Rocha has always been thirsty. The metaphor was chillingly clear. The water wasn't a blessing. It was the source of all this death and decay, the reason for Rocha's insatiable, murderous greed. Matteo's words were filling in the faded lines of Ilara's diary, painting the full, horrific picture in vibrant, terrible color. "I need you to tell me everything," Daniel pleaded, stepping closer to the old man, his desperation overriding his caution. "I found her diary. I know Rocha killed her and made it look like the regime did it, but I can't prove it. It's just words in a book." At the mention of the diary, Matteo's eyes widened, a flicker of shock and something like fear crossing his face. He looked around nervously, as if the trees themselves had ears. "You have her book," he whispered, his voice trembling. Mother of God, Elias kept it. He took a shaky step closer to Daniel, his frail hand gripping Daniel's arm. The grip was surprisingly strong, wiry, and intense. "Then you know the what," he rasped, "but you don't know the where. That's the part Elias never knew, the part I've carried like a stone in my gut for 50 years. He was shaking now, his entire body racked with a tremor that seemed to come from his very soul, the confession of a lifetime fighting its way to the surface. Matteo's eyes filled with tears, ancient rivers carving new paths down the deep gullies of his cheeks. "I was a coward," he choked out, the words ripped from his throat, raw and full of self-loathing. "I was just a boy. I was terrified of him. Everyone was. On the night she vanished, I heard a truck, his truck. It wasn't supposed to be here. I hid. I watched from the trees like a frightened rabbit. He squeezed Daniel's arm tighter, his knuckles white as if trying to transfer the physical weight of his memory. I saw him. Rosha. He wasn't alone. But it was him. And he wasn't going toward the main road. He was heading for the north pasture, the part of the land that's been fallow forever. Daniel felt his own breath catch, his entire body frozen, listening. He could almost see the scene himself. The dark night, the forbidden headlights, the terrified young man hiding in the shadows. He was hearing the missing piece of the story, the eyewitness account that could change everything. I followed, Matteo whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know why. I should have run, but I had to see. He was no longer looking at Daniel, but through him, his eyes focused on a 50-year-old horror. He went to the old well, the one Elias's grandfather built and capped with a stone slab when it ran dry. It was supposed to be a seal, a monument. His voice broke completely, dissolving into a ragged sob. He moved the stone. I don't know how, the strength of the devil himself. They had something wrapped in a canvas tarp. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to block out the memory that had haunted his every waking moment. He put her in the well, Daniel, Matteo finally confessed, the words a torrent of guilt and anguish. He put her body in the well and rolled the stone back into place. He buried her there, in unholy ground, and I watched. I did nothing. I just watched. The terrible secret was finally out, lying exposed between them under the bright or indifferent sun. The world seemed to tilt and spin around Daniel. The well, a grave. The abstract horror of the diary now had a concrete, physical location. It was no longer just a story. It was a crime scene, and Matteo was the only living witness. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening finality. Ilara's body was here, on this land, proof, tangible, undeniable proof that would destroy Dr. Rocha and expose him for the monster he was. A dizzying wave of vindication and terror washed over Daniel. He now held the key not just to justice for Ilara, but to his own salvation. But it was a key that could get him killed. He looked from Matteo's grief-stricken face to the northern edge of the property, the line of dark trees that hid the fallow pasture. It was a place he hadn't even explored yet. And now it had become the most important place on earth. It was a tomb, and it held the truth. The entire 50-year-old crime rested on that single, stone-capped well. Daniel felt a grim, terrible purpose settle over him. He had to see it. He had to stand on that ground to touch that stone. It was a compulsion, a need to make the story physically real. "Show me," he said to Matteo, his voice low and steady, belying the storm of emotion raging inside him. Matteo nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of a calloused, trembling hand. He seemed smaller now, as if the confession had drained him of what little strength he had left, but there was also a flicker of relief in his eyes, the unburdening of a lifetime of guilt. He turned and began to limp toward the north pasture, his staff making soft thuds on the earth. Daniel followed, his heart a heavy, leaden drum in his chest. They walked in silence, moving through the tall, whispering grass, leaving the skeletal ruin of the farmhouse behind them. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as they approached the line of trees, as if they were crossing an invisible threshold into the land of the dead. They found it at the center of a small clearing, half swallowed by tangled vines and overgrown brush. It didn't look like a well. It looked like an ancient, pagan altar, a large, circular slab of granite, about 5 feet in diameter, resting flush with the earth. The stone was grey and mottled with lichen, and a thick, gnarled root from a nearby oak tree had grown over one edge, anchoring it to the ground like a grasping hand. The air here was profoundly still and cold, and a strange and unnatural silence seemed to emanate from the stone itself. Daniel knelt, his hand drawn to the cold, rough surface. He ran his fingers over the granite, feeling its immense, immovable weight. This was it. She was down there, just a few feet beneath his hand, her story silenced by this colossal stone, a wave of profound sorrow for the woman he had never met, and a white-hot fury at the man who had put her here, washed over him, so powerful it made him dizzy. He pressed his ear against the stone, a completely irrational act, as if he could hear something from the darkness below. All he heard was the pulsing of his own blood, He looked for a seam, a crack, any sign of how Rocha could have moved it. It seemed impossible, a task for a machine, not a man. He pushed against the edge with all his might, his boots slipping in the damp earth, his muscles straining. The stone didn't budge a millimeter. It was a perfect, impenetrable seal. He stood up, his mind racing. This was the proof, but it was proof he couldn't access. The well was both the answer and another locked box. But it was a box the authorities could open. This changed everything. With Mateo's testimony and the diary, they would have to listen, they would have to dig. He looked at Mateo, a silent understanding passing between them. The 50-year-old secret was no longer just Mateo's burden to carry. Now, it was Daniel's responsibility to see it through to the end. Far away, on a high ridge overlooking the valley, Dr. Rocha lowered a pair of high-powered binoculars from his eyes. His hands were shaking, not with age, but with a cold, electric fury. He had been watching the farm since dawn, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. First, the arrival of the old fool, Mateo, the ghost he thought had faded into insignificance years ago. And now this. He had watched Daniel and the old man walk directly to the north pasture. He had watched Daniel kneel at the well. He had watched him touch the stone. A cold sweat beaded on Rocha's forehead. They knew. After 50 years of perfect, silent peace, the boy and the old man knew. The carefully constructed wall of fear and time he had built around his secret was crumbling. Panic, an emotion he hadn't felt in decades, clawed at his throat. He could not allow that stone to be moved. He could not allow that story to be told. The risk was too great. The past had to be cauterized, burned away, along with anyone who threatened to uncover it. He pulled out his phone, his thumb jabbing at the screen with violent precision. He made a call. The voice that answered was low and gravelly. "It's time," Rocha said, his own voice a low, vicious snarl, the smooth veneer of the respected doctor completely gone, revealing the predator beneath. "The boy knows he's at the well. I want them gone. Tonight." There was a pause on the other end. "Gone?" the voice asked, seeking clarification. "You're gone." Rocha's lips peeled back from his teeth in a silent, mirthless grin. "Burn the house?" he commanded, the words cold and final. "If they're inside, it's their own tragic accident. If they're not, they'll have nothing to come back to. I want that place wiped off the map by morning. And the diary he has, find it. Understand?" The affirmative grunt from the other end was all the confirmation he needed. He ended the call and looked back through the binoculars at the two small figures walking away from the well, oblivious. They were already ghosts. They just didn't know it yet. That night, the oppressive silence of the farm felt different. It was not the quiet of emptiness, but the charged, waiting silence before a storm breaks. Daniel couldn't settle. After returning from the well, a nervous, kinetic energy had seized him. He had packed their few belongings, a change of clothes, the remaining food, Sophia's small bag of toys, into a single duffel bag. The lead box containing the diary was wrapped in his jacket, ready to be grabbed at a moment's notice. He didn't have a plan, not a real one, but a primal instinct screamed at him that they could not spend another night in this house. He told Sophia they were going camping, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth. He sat by the dying fire, every nerve-ending tingling, his gaze constantly flicking to the dark, gaping more of the windows. He was a sentry guarding against a nameless, shapeless threat that he could feel gathering in the darkness just beyond the tree line. The wait was an agony, a slow grinding torture of the soul. He must have drifted off, his exhausted body finally betraying his vigilant mind. He was jolted awake not by a loud noise, but by a subtle, unnatural sound that his subconscious registered as wrong. A soft splash, like a stone dropped in water, coming from the front of the house. He sat bolt upright, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs. His senses, already on high alert, screamed danger. Then came another sound, a wet, sloshing noise, followed by a low, guttural whisper. He was not alone. They were here. A sharp, chemical odor, acrid and sickeningly sweet, slithered through the cracks in the walls, cutting through the familiar sense of dust and decay. It was a smell he knew instantly, a smell from a world of engines and industry, a smell that had no place in this rural graveyard. Gasoline. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, They weren't just here to threaten him, they were here to erase him, to burn the house, the evidence, and them, down to the very foundations. Panic, pure, white-hot arms and absolute, surged through him, eclipsing every other thought. There was no time to think, no time to plan, only to react. His body moved on pure, primal instinct. He lunged across the small room, scooping up a still sleeping Sophia from her bedroll. She was a dead weight in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, her warm breath on his neck, a stark contrast to the ice in his veins. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the jacket containing the heavy lead box. It was the only other thing that mattered. The diary was their only weapon, Ilara's story, their only hope for survival. He could hear footsteps now, heavy boots on the rotting wood of the porch, the scrape of a metal can being set down. He was out of time. The front door, their only easy exit, was blocked. They were trapped. A wave of claustrophobic terror threatened to drown him, but the warm, solid weight of his daughter in his arms was an anchor, a reason. He raced to the back of the house, to the small window he had been trying to repair. It was their only way out. He didn't hesitate. With Sophia tucked securely under one arm, he swung the heavy crowbar with his other, putting all his strength, all his fear, all his rage into the blow. The sound of the old glass shattering was an explosive, deafening roar in the night. A symphony of destruction that announced their desperate bid for freedom. Shards of glass rained down, glittering like deadly diamonds in the moonlight. He didn't check for jagged edges. He shoved Sophia through the broken frame into the cold, damp weeds outside, her body landing with a soft thud. He tossed the jacket with the diary out after her, then scrambled through the opening himself, ignoring the sharp pain as a shard of glass sliced deep into his forearm. The cold night air hit his face, smelling of damp earth and the terrifying, overwhelming perfume of gasoline. He landed on the ground, rolling to his feet, and scooped Sophia back into his arms. She was awake now, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. A silent, whimpering cry caught in her throat. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," he whispered, the lie a frantic, breathless prayer. As he turned to run, a flicker of movement from the front of the house caught his eye. An orange spark, small and bright, arced through the darkness. A match. It landed on the gasoline-soaked porch, and the world erupted. With a deep, whooshing roar, a wall of brilliant orange flame shot up, devouring the front of the house, painting the night in horrifying, dancing shades of destruction. The heat was instantaneous and intense, a physical blow even from 50 feet away. The skeletal ruin was now a funeral pyre. He didn't look back. Clutching his daughter and the ghost of Ilara, he ran, his feet pounding the cold, hard earth, fleeing the inferno and racing toward the faint, distant light of Matteo's shack. The fire roared behind them, a living, breathing monster that consumed the dry, ancient wood with an insatiable hunger. The sounds were a symphony from hell, the crackling and popping of burning timber, the roar of the flames reaching for the sky, and the sudden, sharp explosions as windows burst from the intense heat. The night was lit as bright as day, their running figures casting long, frantic shadows that danced and leaped with the flames. Daniel's lungs burned, each breath a ragged, painful gasp. The cut on his arm throbbed, a hot, wet trail of blood streaming down to his elbow, but he barely felt it. Adrenaline and pure terror were the only things fueling his legs, driving him forward across the uneven field. He risked a single, fleeting glance over his shoulder. The farmhouse, the place of his false hope and his terrible discovery, was now a towering inferno, a colossal torch against the black velvet of the night sky, its smoke and embers a funeral plume rising to the indifferent stars. He had escaped the tomb, but the monster was now fully awake and enraged. He stumbled through the darkness, his only guide the tiny, flickering yellow light of Matteo's distant cabin. It was a pinprick of hope in an ocean of terrifying darkness and raging fire. Sophia was crying now, quiet. Terrified sobs muffled against his shoulder. He held her tighter, whispering incoherent words of comfort, his own voice choked with smoke and fear. The weight of her body, combined with the heavy lead box tucked under his arm, was an agonizing burden, but he would sooner cut off his own limbs than let go of either. One held his future, the other held the key to justice for the past. They were inextricably linked, a heavy inheritance he was now forced to carry through fire and darkness. The smell of smoke was thick in the air, a constant reminder of the inferno at his back and the burning away of his last connection to this cursed land. He wasn't just running from a fire, he was running from a past that was trying to burn him alive. Matteo was waiting for them on the porch of his tiny, ramshackle cabin, a small and frail silhouette against the flickering lantern light. The old man must have seen the fire from the moment it started. He had a shotgun cradled in his arms, its long barrel glinting in the light. His face was a mask of grim resolve. As Daniel staggered into the small circle of light and collapsed onto the steps, gasping for air, Matteo didn't ask questions. He simply took the shotgun and pointed it back toward the darkness from which they had come. "Get inside," he commanded, his reedy voice now hard as iron. "Both of you. He won't stop with the house." Daniel, his body screaming with exhaustion and pain, half carried, half dragged Sophia into the single-room cabin. The space was small and cramped, but felt like the strongest fortress in the world. It smelled of wood smoke, old books, and coffee. It smelled of safety. Daniel gently laid Sophia down on a narrow cot, pulling a thick, hand-stitched quilt over her trembling body. Her eyes were wide with a terror he knew would haunt her for years to come. He stroked her hair, his hand stained with his own blood, and whispered promises of safety that he had no idea if he could keep. He then turned his attention to his arm. In the steady lamplight, the gash was deep and ugly, still oozing dark blood. Matteo came back inside, bolting the thick wooden door behind him. He looked at the wound, then at Daniel's pale, exhausted face, and gave a grim, knowing nod. Without a word, he retrieved a bottle of cheap whiskey and a clean rag from a cupboard. "This will sting," he said, his voice softening slightly. It was a profound understatement. The searing pain as the alcohol hit the open wound was blinding, but it was a clean, honest pain, a welcome distraction from the complex, soul-deep terror that had taken root inside him. As Matteo bandaged his arm, Daniel placed the heavy, jacket-wrapped lead box on the small wooden table. He unwrapped it, the dark, heavy metal looking ominous and ancient in the lamplight. He opened the lid. The scent of jasmine, impossibly, still lingered, a fragile, beautiful ghost in a room that smelled of blood, fear and impending violence. He looked at the diary, at the bundle of letters, at the single pressed flower. These small, fragile things had almost gotten them killed. They were both a curse and a sacrament. He felt a fierce, renewed wave of determination. He had not survived the fire to run and hide. Rosha had escalated this war, turning it from a battle of secrets and threats to one of open, brutal violence. He had made his move, and in doing so he had given Daniel his own terrible purpose, not just to reveal the truth, but to see justice done, no matter the cost. He looked up at Matteo, who was staring at the open box with a look of awe and sorrow. "He sent them to kill us," Daniel said, the words stark and cold. "And to get this." Matteo nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the old shotgun. "He knows we have the truth," the old man whispered, "and now he knows we will not be silenced by threats or by money, so now he will try to silence us with force." He moved to the single small window, peering out into the darkness that was still faintly illuminated by the distant, dying glow of the fire. "They will be coming here next," Matteo said, his voice grim. "They saw you run this way. They know you're with me." The cabin, which moments before had felt like a fortress, suddenly felt like a fragile, wooden trap. The walls seemed to shrink, the darkness outside pressing in, filled with the promise of more violence. They had won a brief reprieve, but the night was far from over. The hunt had just begun. Inside the tiny cabin, the air was a thick cocktail of fear and defiance. The acrid smell of burning pine from their torched home mingled with the sharp scent of whiskey from the rag on Daniel's arm, and the earthy aroma of old wood that was Matteo's entire world. Outside, the night was no longer silent. It pulsed with the distant, dying roar of the fire, a constant, visceral reminder of how close they had come to being erased. Sophia slept fitfully on the narrow cot, her small body occasionally twitching, her dreams likely filled with the monstrous orange glow of the flames. Daniel sat rigid at the small table, the heavy lead box before him like a dark covenant. Matteo stood guard at the door, the old shotgun held with a familiarity that spoke of a long, hard life. He was no longer just a grieving old man. He was a sentinel, his ancient eyes scanning the darkness. Then he turned from the door, his face set with a decision that seemed decades in the making. "There is one chance," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle. "A call I have been afraid to make for years." Matteo reached into a loose floorboard, a hiding spot just as secret as the one Daniel had found, and pulled out a small, plastic-wrapped object. It was an old burner phone, a relic of a more paranoid time. Its battery kept alive for this exact moment. With trembling fingers, he keyed in a number written on a faded scrap of paper. Daniel held his breath, the sound of the beeps unnaturally loud in the tense silence. The call connected. Matteo spoke in low, urgent tones, a torrent of Spanish that Daniel only partially understood, but the key words were universal. Ilara, the well, the diary, Rocha, fire. The voice that replied was not what Daniel expected. It was a woman's, calm, crisp, and filled with an immediate authority that cut through the static of the cheap phone. She asked sharp, precise questions, her tone leaving no room for doubt. She didn't promise help. She confirmed its arrival. "Stay inside. Lock the door. Do not engage. We are moving." "Dawn," was the final command before the line went dead. The hours until dawn were the longest of Daniel's life. The initial adrenaline of the escape had curdled into a bone-deep, gnawing anxiety. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh spike of terror through him. He imagined Rocha's men circling the shack, waiting, their faces illuminated by the dying glow of his incinerated home. The fire's distant crackle was a constant, hellish soundtrack to their vigil. He went to Sophia's cot, his heart aching as he watched her sleep. He gently touched his bandaged arm, the clean, sharp pain a grounding sensation in the sea of his fear. He looked at Ilara's diary, its silent pages holding a 50-year-old scream for justice. He was now its voice. The false hope of the farm had been burned away, leaving only this raw, terrifying chance at a real one. As the first pale, grey light began to filter through the grimy window, it felt less like a sunrise and more like a final curtain rising on the last act of their tragedy or their triumph. His fate was coming down the dirt road. It began not with the roar of a monster truck, but with the quiet hum of powerful, professional engines. 2 black sedans and a white van with no markings appeared at the end of the dirt track, moving with a confident speed that defied the rough terrain. They didn't look like local police. They looked like the government. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and exhilarating relief. Men in dark tactical gear emerged, their movements efficient and silent, securing the perimeter of Matteo's property with an unspoken, disciplined authority. Then, a door on the lead sedan opened, and a woman in a tailored dark suit stepped out. She was the voice from the phone, her sharp, intelligent face scanning the scene, taking in the smoking ruin in the distance and the small, defiant shack. Matteo unbolted the door and stepped out to meet her. As she approached, her gaze met Daniel's through the doorway. In her eyes, he saw not pity, but the grim determination of a warrior arriving on the battlefield. The cavalry had arrived. Inside the cramped cabin, the air thick with the smell of stale fear and fresh coffee, Daniel laid out the evidence. The lead box sat open on the table, a strange, sacred altar. He placed the worn leather diary, the faded ribbon-tied letters, and the single ghostly jasmine flower before the lawyer, a woman named Isabella. He told the story, his voice cracking at first, then steadying with a cold fury as he recounted Ilara's words and Rocha's threats. Isabella listened without interruption, her fingers gently tracing the cover of the diary, as if she could feel the history radiating from it. Her expression remained unreadable, but a muscle twitched in her jaw as he described the fire. While he spoke, a team of forensics experts, their white suits a stark contrast to the rustic squalor, gathered outside. Matteo, his face a mixture of terror and vindication, spoke quietly with the lead investigator, pointing a trembling finger toward the north pasture. The methodical, professional process of unearthing the truth had begun, a silent, powerful machine rolling over Rocha's empire of fear. The scene at the well was one of quiet, grim purpose. The forensics team had cleared the overgrowth, revealing the ancient stone slab in its entirety. The air was cold, heavy with anticipation. They brought in a portable A-frame hoist, its modern steel and cables looking alien against the ancient trees. With a low hydraulic whine, the chains tightened, biting into the edges of the granite slab. Daniel stood back with Sophia, holding her hand so tightly his knuckles were white. He had to bear witness. Matteo stood beside him, his lips moving in a silent prayer, his entire body trembling. There was a deep groaning sound as the seal, undisturbed for half a century, was broken. The massive stone lifted, revealing a dark, circular moor in the earth. A wave of cold, musty air, the smell of a tomb, washed over them. An investigator was lowered into the darkness. After a long, agonizing silence, his voice echoed up, muffled but clear. "We have it. Human remains, wrapped in canvas." A collective, sorrowful sigh went through the group. Ilara was free. The convoy of black sedans moved like a silent pack of wolves, descending the hill from the ruined farm and sweeping onto Dr. Rocha's immaculate property. They didn't use sirens. Their arrival was a quiet, suffocating assertion of a higher authority. They found Rocha on the veranda of his sprawling, modernist mansion, enjoying his morning coffee in a silk dressing gown, overlooking the valley that he believed he owned. His face, when he saw the federal police flooding his manicured lawn, was a masterpiece of crumbling arrogance. The confident smirk of the untouchable patriarch curdled into slack-jawed disbelief. When Isabella presented the warrant, mentioning the excavation at the old well, his face went ashen. All the color drained away, leaving only the waxy pallor of a cornered animal. The mask of the respected doctor disintegrated completely, revealing the vicious, terrified killer beneath. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around his frail, liver-spotted wrists, his eyes were not defiant. They were empty. The empire of fear had fallen. Weeks later, Daniel sat in a sterile, glass-walled office in the capital, the city's noise a distant, muted hum. The dust and grime of the farm felt a lifetime away. Isabella sat across from him, a thick file on the desk between them. Rocha, she explained, had been unraveled. The investigation had uncovered a web of corruption, extortion, and murder, tied to his service during the dictatorship. He would die in prison, but that wasn't all. Ilara was a documented political activist, Isabella said, her voice soft. Her family was part of a class-action lawsuit against the state. She pushed a document across the desk. As her story is now central to this, and as you were the target of a known regime informant, a National Victims Fund has awarded you significant compensation. Daniel looked at the number on the page. It had so many zeros he couldn't process it. It wasn't just enough to pay his debts. It was enough to build a new world. The crushing weight that had defined his existence for years evaporated in a single silent moment. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sorrow, but of a relief so profound it felt holy. A year later, the scent of jasmine hung heavy and sweet in the afternoon air. The farmhouse stood on the hill, reborn. It was not a ruin, but a masterpiece of wood and stone, crafted with the love and skill of Daniel's own two hands. The porch no longer sagged. It was wide and welcoming. Inside, the rooms were filled with light and the sound of Sophia's laughter as she ran in from the garden, her hands full of flowers for the table. The aroma of a slow-cooked beef stew, rich and hearty, wafted from the kitchen, a promise of abundance and warmth. In the newly built workshop behind the house, the satisfying hum of a high-end lathe filled the air. Daniel was shaping a piece of beautiful cherry wood, the shavings curling at his feet. His hands, once rendered useless by despair, were now creating beauty and security. He was no longer a victim of circumstances, but the proud architect of his family's future. He had not just rebuilt a house, he had rebuilt a life from the ashes, honoring the promise he had made to his wife in every beam and every board. As evening fell, Daniel stood on his new porch, a cup of coffee warming his hands, and watched the sunset bleed across the sky. He was no longer a trespasser on this land, he was its guardian. Sophia sat beside him, drawing in a sketchbook, the picture of a happy, safe child. He thought of Ilara, the woman whose ghostly fragrance and fierce words had reached across 5 decades to pull him from the abyss. He thought of his wife and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that she would be proud. The ghosts of the farm were finally at peace, their stories told, their murderer brought to justice. His journey, from the suffocating despair of a tiny apartment to the expansive peace of this valley was a testament to the enduring power of truth and the unbreakable strength of a father's love. What story of courage lies dormant in your own family's history? If you believe that some truths are worth fighting for, subscribe to our channel and join us for more stories of justice that refuse to be buried.